gonna go ahead and start. I think it's citizens engaging their communities to improve conditions in all facets, whether it be in education, whether it even be for trash pickup. It's building those coalitions and building those organizations. For example, in Mesquite, we just formulated the NAACP, which I think it works in concert with 2 neighboring cities. And we also have a Hispanic Forum of Mesquite that also works to build programs for Hispanic youth. And they've been really, really instrumental at our school in providing scholarships and other things for a lot of our students.
So like,
from New Jersey.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. So you want me to go? Okay. So when I think of civic engagement, I also think of, and piggybacking off of Greg, skills, motivation, next steps. How can we best prepare our communities for even situations like this? So what comes to mind is, I know in our community here in Brooklyn, we have Bridge Street Corporation, and they actually help a lot of the brownstone owners in knowing their neighborhoods, knowing their communities. If you're going to sell, who to sell to, that way you can keep the money within the community, but also they help with youth, right? So I know a large part of our focus, especially today, would be how do we best prepare students for what's going on outside? With Bridge Street, that's exactly what they're doing. They're impacting the youth while also helping out the elders.
So then I was going to just jump in and talk about here in Jersey. So there are no real big cities. And the main threat that I've been able to try and educate about out here is that so many of the Black neighborhoods and communities have been destroyed over the last 20 to 30 years, that gentrification has turned into displacement and erasure. And so mainly it's senior citizens who are now passing away, especially during the last crisis. So the medical issues, the actual food and care, energy needs, people that need electricity or need heating oil. These are the things where we're building networks, trying to preserve like the last little remnants in places like Asbury Park. We just won a victory last week to get subsidized housing so that Black community would not be completely removed from an area where the property values have increased by 10 times. So like that kind of thing where we get people to keep their homes, hold their foothold in the schools, and be able to live comfortably without having to make an extra $100,000 a year. That's what we're facing right here in Jersey.
I'll jump in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Shalina. I'll go last.
Okay. So to me, civic engagement is what you all said, just developing skills, knowledge, and actions that can improve your community. When I think about what I do with my students in DC at my school, Dunbar High School, just trying to give them opportunities to affect change. So do it politically, non-politically, just giving them a voice. And I have a special case because I have an academy, the Lyon Public Policy Academy, and I try to expose my students through that academy, writing letters to elected officials. And we just recently protested at the White House, and starting a peer court program, just different things to get them involved and letting them know that they have a voice. And I think when we look outside of our school community, it's the same thing. You want to be able to have a voice. That's civic engagement, using your voice in whatever way that looks to you.
And I'll bring it up. Everybody's brought up some really great examples. One more thing I would add is, civic engagement is kind of like civic problem solving and critical thinking. Where are the spaces in my community that, are not being filled or are not being adequately supported? Where can I lend my support and expertise? Allowing students to kind of explore those ideas in the classroom and then being able to take them out of the classroom and into the community. So, just wanting to remember that civic engagement is all about figuring out, how do I make my community better? How do I solve those problems that are touching either myself or the people around me?
Okay, great. So how can we use hard history, both contemporary and dated history, to shape a discussion and community building that facilitates civic engagement, agency, and authenticity?
Well, I personally think that you have to teach the hard history. I think too often educators get hard history fatigue, if I could coin that phrase. You know, you get tired of teaching slavery. Oh my God, it's such a Debbie Downer, but it has to be taught. I know that the current, in popular culture, you know, we need to leave up these monuments, but that's, you know, I don't know if that's necessarily the right way, because to me, I see a lot of those as odes to a glorification of past wrongs. I really like how Germany embraces it, in that they require their students to learn those hard histories in a very authentic way. They take them to concentration camps. They're required to do that, so that it doesn't get to a point where an educator is like, oh, you know, let's get 6 weeks of the Elizabethan age, and then whoops, we ran out of time. We can't teach the Incas. We can't teach the Zulu Nation. Oh my God, we can't get to the Shang Dynasty. You know, we got to move on.
I'll jump in. I'd also like to move away from the word hard history a little bit. Like, I would love for the whole field to shift and just call it like truthful history or complete history, right? Because when you say something is a hard history, then you're allowing a person to make a moral choice whether they should teach it or not, right? When you're telling someone you're teaching complete histories or truthful histories, you know, then when they make the choice to leave it out, then it's like, well, why are you leaving out part of the truth or the complete story? And so, you know, hopefully as a field, we begin to embrace the fact that there is complexity within all stories of the existence of humanity. And we want to make sure that we tackle the entire story from both sides, and then allow students to think critically and analyze both narratives and say, this is a complete story, and then what else is missing? I need to find out more.
So for me, I think that if our ultimate goal is to prepare students, right? So we know in education, we're supposed to teach students how to become critical thinkers, how to analyze, how to think deeply, but also how to question things. Once history is written in the form of textbooks that does not allow a kid to really question things, we are actually not educating our students fully. And I think that that is the main reason why we are where we are today. A lot of people are questioning, why is race such a big issue in America? It's because people have left out, and I'm just going to be very frank, all of the factors that has led us here. So African Americans have built this nation, Mexican Americans have built this nation, immigrants have built this nation, Asian Americans, Asians, we have all built this nation. But our textbooks only leave one sentence that says that. And our students are only getting that introduction. And so when you have it where everyone now is saying, how did we get here? We got here because our textbooks failed to mention most of the most pivotal aspects of history. And then as educators, because we're following this curricula that was invented by someone who is not even in a classroom, we're missing out on using it as an opportunity to help our students grow. I have countless experiences where students are leaving my classrooms to enter colleges, and they're struggling in college. They're not struggling because they're lacking skill. They're struggling because they're lacking knowledge. We're not pushing them as far as we can push them, as far as we push ourselves when we hit that college level. We have to do better.
So I'll jump in just with 2 quick assignments. A lot of times folks around my area, they'll have folks do little genealogy projects or interview a parent or a grandparent about where they came from, a migration story, and just tell that story. But I think a lot of times we got to like broaden that out, so they're not just telling the story that they need to hear about family and their community, but stretch that out so they're looking at, like, how did this all happen? Like, before just my family, who else was here? How can I tell a different story than just what shapes my perspective? And I think the questioning point is central. I want to really hammer behind that. Like, learning to ask really good questions is like the main point. And so if I was seeing more people coming to me in middle school and high school, let alone college, that they could frame better questions, everything else opens up to them. So all of my books are all built around questions. They're all built around alternative ways to look at historical documents. You're not just going to find one answer. You're going to find thousands of answers, thousands of stories, and be able to appreciate just how much there is to learn, and that you got to keep doing it your whole life.
So I guess I waited until the end to speak, and now I really don't have anything to add because everything that was said is absolutely correct. Just empowering our students, giving them an opportunity to right the wrongs of the past, letting them see how they can fit into it and the connection between the past and the future. That's really all I'm going to say.
Okay, great. How do we balance organic grassroots community politics with that of established politicians and keep the buy-in voting for all political agendas? What are some steps as a community that we can take to help build lasting coalitions and collaborations?
Well, I'm going to use that word fatigue again, and I think we have to find a way to get young people to see that all elections matter. I know a lot of us as adults, we'll focus on the presidential election. We'll get to the Senate or the mayoral elections, like, oh, I don't have time for that. I got to go. I got an appointment here or there. But we have to teach our students. We have to teach our young people to see that these are important and that they affect their lives as well. For example, in my city, when we instituted a teenage curfew, the students were like, oh my God, that's not right. I said, well, you guys in 2.5 years will be 18 years old and can vote. Same goes for standard dress. We have standard dress in my district. I said, hate it or love it, guys, it's who you elect for the school board. Those things matter. And so we've got to get people to demand transparency of their local, state, and federal officials as well is another thing. As we see in current day, in current events, that, transparency matters. And without that, we're going to be in a heck of a fix, as my mom would say.
And to piggyback off of Mr. Hill, local elections very important. We need to get our students more involved, but also you can do that by garnering support from local organizations, such as here in DC, we have MICVA Challenge DC. They're also headquartered in Chicago, where students can, they work with the students and they'll get out the vote and go out and vote nonpartisan. So you'll have Republican and Democrat candidates the students are working for and stomping for, and just learning how to be civically engaged and learn how their voice can be heard just by simply doing little simple things for candidates. And also, if nothing else, at your school or in the community, having town halls, listening sessions that students can lead or participate in. Yeah, that I'll stop talking. I'll keep going.
I'll jump in. I don't know if anyone watched Obama's address. The Obama Foundation, I think they had an address on live stream. What was it, yesterday? And so he said something that I was like, I've been saying that. That's cool. It's an inside-outside game, right? Political change and community change and transformational change. You do need the grassroots political action, right? You need people out there who are pushing and, pressing the system and, standing up for, justice. But then you also need people on the inside who are listening to those people outside and willing to make the changes that the people on the outside are asking for. And so it's just really important to impress upon our students that, hey, yes, let's get out in the community, let's go, stand up for something, but also you need to make sure that you vote for people who are aligned with your ideals, right? And maybe that's you one day, right? Maybe that's you one day who will be voted for to align with the ideals of those people who feel oppressed outside. So, it's not just I go vote, and it's not just I go protest, it is a both and.
Just for a second, I'm going to interject with this piece. With middle school students, you can build small projects for 2 or 3 students in teams where they go out and identify community needs or just talk to people about in the street what's going on. And so when you build into the classroom a way that they feel invested in the community, where they can begin to imagine themselves taking leadership, that stays with them. They can continue to build on that and move forward. It's not just about meeting the assessment, getting the kind of benchmark of what they're going to do, showing how their lives are in their hands. That's life-changing.
I would also like to include, let's just look at the word grassroots, right? When we think about that term, we have to think that it came about because there was a problem. And these organizations or these politics, their job is to create a solution. If we ask the students, you know, how are they doing, or what's going on at home, or what did you see yesterday, we would then begin to know the real problems. Our students are our voices. Some of us don't live in the same neighborhoods as our students. And so when we think about politics, we have to also acknowledge the fact that our students are dealing with problems on a day-to-day basis. And so when we ask them to address different challenges, for me, it's very important for me to ask them to address challenges that they're facing, as opposed to just challenges that they see on TV. It has to be some kind of connection in order for it to be very important to students.
Okay, what does equity for all look like in the classroom, campus, district, and what role can all stakeholders take to ensure equity for all?
Well, I'm going to start with a little story about when I was in first grade. Well, my first grade teacher, I was one of the few, being one of the few Black kids in class. And all of the stories we read didn't look like me. And so I really couldn't relate to them at first. You know, the first time you read it, I say, okay, great. But then it just got really, really boring. And so later on, as I became an educator, I said that, and I would ask her, I was like, hey, can we read some other kind of stories? What stories about, maybe the Jackson 5? I'm kind of dating myself here, but she's like, no, we can't read those kind of stories. Those aren't fit for school. I'm like, oh, okay. But everyone has to have a voice or a chance to be heard. And I feel, and maybe it's pie in the sky, but I don't care. I think everyone needs to show up in the curriculum, somewhere in the curriculum from K through 12. I've seen countless, I remember the first time I went to the school I'm currently at and meet the teacher night, and I had the longest line of anybody because everybody wanted to meet the new Black teacher. Oh, you're my child's first Black teacher. You're my child's first male teacher. Well, that makes a big difference. As our classrooms become more integrated and diverse, even if you're not let's say you have a class full of Asian kids, you need to understand and give them those experiences and help them learn through their experiences and their culture. Educators have to regulate the conversation to make sure that those stereotypes and their own personal biases don't show up in the classwork, don't show up in the discussion, don't show up in interpersonal relationships between teacher and student, student to student, administrator to teacher, et cetera, et cetera. So it's incumbent on us to be that conduit to make sure that happens.
I'll jump in behind Greg and say, I had a podcast episode with my kids and I asked them essentially the same question. And they were like, I don't understand. Essentially, I don't understand why everyone's story is not added to the curriculum. And I was like, you know what? You guys better preach. They were like, every single race deserves to have a story. And that story needs to be read by everybody else, right? So equity means it's like, we're not having, Black books for Black kids or Asian books for Asian kids or Indigenous books for Indigenous kids or Hispanic books for Hispanic kids. No, we're reading these stories so that everyone can have a richer understanding of what it means to be a part of the human experience. So +1 on you, Greg. I will also add a little bit more on, what equity looks like. I think it's just considering for sure what the needs of the population you're serving, right? And then fully addressing those needs, and that means if you have to survey your parent base to figure that out, if you have to go out in the community and just ask some random people in the community what's going on, right? It's being invested in the community that you're teaching in and finding out what those kids need, and then allowing the curriculum to heal those kids' needs, to educate those kids' needs, to elevate those kids' needs, to build confidence around those kids' needs, so that those students, once they leave your school building, they are much better people than they were when they first walked in.
Definitely agree with everything that has been. Definitely agree with everything that has been said. Just a few things I would want to say. We talked about making sure everyone is being seen in the curriculum, but also how we teach the curriculum. So going back to what Amber said about learning the interest of your students, knowing your students, listening to them, hearing them, I think is very important. And then also when you're talking about stakeholders from outside of the building, giving them the opportunity to say, how can I help in the school, whether it's volunteering at the district level, at the school level, coming in and talking to students as a guest speaker, a lawyer or some sort, just coming in and providing opportunities to all students so that they can see a wide array of careers and different people that they may not come into contact with and opportunities. And just making sure that, going back to student voice, I can't say that enough.
So I definitely agree with everyone. Equity is definitely inclusion. And I just want to say it's beyond just giving text that discusses African Americans or giving text that's in a different language, right? In order for you to have a classroom that's inclusive, you have to build authentic relationships with students, meaning you can't be afraid of the students that you teach. Because if you're afraid of them, you can never prepare effectively for that student or that population. And I'm saying this because within this past 2 weeks, I don't know, I'm on Twitter, obviously, right? And every material that I'm now seeing on Twitter screams out anti-racist unit or anti-racist curriculum. How can you prepare for students who, one, you probably were afraid of, so you never really addressed in your classroom? Two, you don't know nothing about them besides the fact that they are of color. And three, first of all, what's their name, right? So when we think about inclusion, you also have to think about what kind of music the kids like. Are they auditory learners? Are they kinesthetic learners? Who are your students? So when we think about what kind of curricula we have to build in September, use this summer to really prepare for the students you have. Maybe you may want to, ask students to create a TikTok or some kind of Flipgrid, just introducing themselves. And that's how you prepare for now, including this topic of race, which we know for some reason, I keep telling everyone, students of color know about race. This is nothing new to us. We grew up knowing about race. We grew up knowing which neighborhood to walk in, which neighborhood not to walk in, who to say hi to, who looks a little sketchy. And so when I see anti-racist curricula, I'm scared. And I'm scared because for me, being a person of color and teaching students of color, I know how quick my students may shut down because you're telling them something that's not new. So what are you going to bring to the table that now says to the kid, all right, she cares about me? Beyond just saying, this is how you respond to a racist act, or don't say that in class. That's not real, that's not inclusive, and we have to get down to what's next. And what's next is take the time out to know who your students are beyond how they look, right? Because looks could be very deceiving anyway. I feel like it's always quiet after I go.
Well, I do want to interject though that equity also has to include access for kids that are handicapped, that are wheelchair bound, that may have sight impairment. I think oftentimes they also get lost in the shuffle and lost in the discussion, and should have a place at the table as well.
And in reimagining our schools in advance of the fall semester, going with that, what are some recommended readings, websites, apps to help foster collegiality and equity among students, educators, and administrators?
I'm just going to jump in real quick and say this. Y'all need to read Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. Everyone needs to read that this summer. I'm not like promoting the dude. He's not paying me to promote this book, but I thoroughly think, you know, I read it. Some members on my staff have read it. It's a transformative book, and it definitely gets your gears going, and it gets you to think a little bit differently. And I, as a Black woman, right, in my own identity, have called to question some of my own ideas about how the world actually is. And so, you know, if I can do that, I know other people can. So I'm just gonna throw that out there.
Just real quickly, because that's my specialty is books, and I could talk for an hour just rattling titles. But if we put together a Google Doc and kind of thematically break it up so we could speak about each piece, yeah, that I think would be useful for everybody. The other side, tying back to the last point about access equity and how do we mobilize everybody in the classroom to get the most out of it. My best stuff in the last couple of years has been converting a lot of written text into video content. So if you get real comfortable doing stuff like we're doing right now, but actually animating that with your students so that they're able to interact with you through video, even short video, you know, like they're looking at it on their phone, they're looking at it on their laptop or iPad, whatever it is, like that's just going to bring it to life. And particularly a lot of like the next generation of my scholarship is building content, especially historical content, into video games. And so little games where students are coming in and they get to play it as part of class, but there's also discussion with readings, there's real writing that comes with it. And so if you're building in a memorable experience, you know, a lot of my stuff looks like Fortnite. And so they're going to go in there and they're playing with their buddies trying to get through a lesson plan. But then they come out of there, they're like, when can I play again? That was amazing. Can I get a different outcome from that? Like these interactive technologies, we got to be real serious and purposeful about how we bring them to the students we're trying to serve.
+1 on the games, but I'm biased because I'm at iCivics, but +1 on the games.
So I'm a big fan of simulations. For my students, they had access to technology in school, but not out of school. So I always felt like it was very important for me, not only to introduce the African-American experience or the Mexican-American experience, but to allow them to act it out. So I'm a big fan of having fun, and by fun, I still mean learning, but to see students, I taught the Constitutional Convention and I had students represent each state. And I posed different questions, but for some students, it was probably just like, you know, this teacher's crazy. She has us doing all this research. And for me, it was, I wanted you to feel what it was probably like at that time to have to now have an opinion on slavery and have an opinion on whether or not representation should be increased or taxation should be increased. And it allowed students to get deeper in depth with, these are the decisions that were made, and they were very selfish, but keep in mind, they didn't really see African Americans as human beings, right? And so, of course, these larger states are now going to benefit from this idea of slavery, and where some people at first probably was totally against it, now they're going to be for it because they see the benefits of it. Or even when we teach the Constitution and I teach the slavery grievance, you have to give kids the opportunity to see some of the things through their own lens. So I may provide very basic information, and the kids sometimes are frustrated because they're just like, Ms. V, you know, how could you only give me 2 paragraphs? And you expect me to write this entire paper? Duh, start your own research. You know, I don't use textbooks in my room. I've created interactive workbooks because I figured out that if you let the kid actually create their own outcomes, so diaries and letters of advice, then now they're taking part in history, right? Now we're allowing them to become real historians. Now you get to see if they fully understand the content or if it was just like, I'm doing it just because I just don't want to hit home Friday. So you have to give your kids chances to do even simulations. And because we're doing remote learning now, I still have kids doing simulations. I just have them posted on Flipgrid now. So you're still acting out, you're still creating raps, you're still creating songs, you're still writing letters of advice, but now it's more advanced, right? So it's still the same high expectation. I'm still taking it to a different level. You're just posting it somewhere. So giving your kids the opportunity to act out, trust me, first of all, you're gonna have fun. Like I had fun seeing kids in judges' wigs, right? But you're going to now notice, this is probably where I went wrong with that specific standard or that objective, or when that kid asked you for extra assistance and you probably was tied up with the 26 other kids. And so he may get this question wrong, but then you also see what other kids did the research without you, and you may learn something totally new.
Okay, so how do we shape our classrooms, schools, districts to be more culturally responsive? And how do we build our schools to be a flagship of the community?
I think that one of my teaching philosophy is to teach to my target audience. But I think as a school, we need to reach our target audience in everything we do. So, for example, we have a college night, and typically that's done in English, but 56% of our student population is Hispanic, and Spanish is their first language. So we've gone from having one college night solely in English to a second college night in Spanish. And we've had so many parents like, oh my God, this is the first school that's really allowed me to understand what's going on. I think that's been a roadblock for a lot of our Hispanic students, for simply not having the knowledge of where to go, access to scholarships and things like that. I think also you have to have outlets for kids to express their culture. So for example, we have a African dance club. We have a gospel singing club. We even have a country music club. So, the kids have these outlets to express themselves and do it at school.
I'll add feedback, right? I know I keep saying feedback, but I think just getting feedback is the best way of building the community that you want to have, right? So just making sure you're checking in, at least, as far as school administrators, quarterly, check in with your educators, check in, with the students, check in with the parent community and the PTA. And then also have an open forum once a year to check in with the community, right? What does the community expect of your school? What is your relationship? Your school is situated within a community, within a neighborhood, on a street, so what does the community expect of you? What are your expectations of the community? So, creating collaborative processes and collaborative experiences requires you to humble yourself and leverage feedback. So I will say that.
I would say creating a board that consists of the people from the community. In my opinion, too often we allow others to create laws and decisions that impact us and our students, and they have nothing to do with the community. They've probably never seen our students before, and in many cases they don't come and visit our classrooms to even know what we're doing, right? And then when we do see them, it's almost like, this is an observation, this is what I think you should do. This person hasn't been in the classroom in 30 years, but he's telling you what you should do for your students, the students that you've been with for 6 months. And so I think that if you create a board that's for the people, by the people, right? So some stakeholders who actually work in the school and in the community, that would increase cultural relevancy, because now we can problem solve. Now we know what's not working, what hasn't been working, and what we need to do next as a community to ensure that our kids are actually doing good. When you incorporate the community in anything, of course there's going to be an increase in achievement, because this is some of their kids who are actually attending our schools. So of course they're going to now want to have or take ownership in what's next, right? Progress is everything, but community outweighs that, because with community, then we can move forward as a people.
That's exactly my point. I put this in the chat, but schools are economic units. And when you build in your board like that, when you build in the people who have the capital to show these students how to go out in the world and sustain themselves, that changes everything. I got my third book was all about that, American economy, and how do you show people how to make the most of the legal structure so that they can build real ownership for themselves. But then I was giving away pieces of it for free. Really the critical pieces are in Engine of Creation, about showing a student in 7th or 8th grade, how do they maintain 3 streams of income? How do they actually not have to rely on just one full-time job? Like, which things in their region are going to generate the most investment, where they get partners who give them like Shark Tank money, $50,000, $100,000 up front to build a new organization, build a new company. Like, all of that is out there for us, and our schools can make that work for each of these communities and these neighborhoods. But a lot of times, like, we don't take the time to figure out how to build the connection. And it works for teachers too, and principals, superintendents. Like, you can build that same structure out so that you're actually enriching all the people around you because of your creativity. And so, you know, I came out of hip hop, so that was always my orientation, to build stable wealth for my people. So writing about that, making it happen, you know, anybody wants that, I give it away for free. We can get started.
Okay, what is culturally responsive text as it pertains to education, and how do we connect that to civics?
Well, again, I'm gonna go back to, that's where all the kids show up in all the text, and you know, so for example, or it could be something to the effect that I'm kind of flipping the script a little bit. It could be something in kindergarten where, you know, you have a kid that says, hey, you know, I don't look like Cinderella, and you have them draw themselves as Cinderella. Just, you know, kind of reminds me of the Hidden Figures Barbies that are out, that are very popular. When kids show up, you know, they have more buy-in.
I think we have to look beyond color and race as well. So we have to look at student interests. And so, you know, you guys talked about playing games, and I talked about music. Those are what our students like to hear, like to do. And so culturally relevant just literally means knowing and preparing for the students who are in your room and those students who are coming in, right? Because it doesn't just stop with the ones who are in your room. So I was actually having this conversation actually before we began this Zoom, and I talked about the fact that as educators, we have to keep creating different opportunities for students to learn. And so if you know the students did great with this simulation, or the students did great with this game, how do you now take that and level up, right? How do you now push that to the next level so that the kids are now interested in doing certain things? So one example was, I've been teaching for 10 years, and I've been teaching Henry Ford's automobile almost like the same exact way, right? Because we know in New York State, you have to prepare the kids for the regents. And the answer to the regents is always the assembly line, hands down. That's always the answer. I don't know whoever creates it. I'm gonna have to talk to them, right? So I always taught it the same way. Talked about the automobile, talked about Henry Ford, assembly line is your answer, let's move forward. This year, I decided, you know what? That's whack, that's dry. My kids are just like running past it. They're not really understanding that at this time, even though Henry Ford was making a lot of money by selling these cars at a cheaper price and paying his workers more, but allowing them to work less, African Americans were still not being paid the same amount. And so how did he become so rich? And I had kids create a commercial, and the kids had to act it out, but they were all different people. So you had one being a housewife, and you had one being the car salesman, and you had another one being a gangster. And the idea was that I used, have you guys heard of the Lego robotics? Yes. So I had the kids use that and learn programming, right? So for me, it's, yes, this is a topic that I usually fly by, but I needed to take that opportunity to also teach my kids something that they're not going to get a class at my school learning, which is programming and robotics. And when we finished Henry Ford, I gave them another project. Now your next project is to take those same pieces and create something else. And so we have to push our students, but we have to use what they like to push them. Most of my kids don't like to read. They don't like to read. And so how do we make sure that we prepare our students for the next steps? How do we give students the content and know that, all right, if I give him this 5-page paper, he's not going to read it. He's not going to read past the first page. And tomorrow when I ask him about it, he's probably only going to recite to me the first page he memorized. Give him hands-on tasks, right? Acting out and seeing the kids do that commercial, the kids played a specific role. So we learned about flappers, and we learned about gangsters, and we learned about prohibition, all in one unit as opposed to me teaching everything separately.
I'll also add just making sure, obviously bringing in, but you want to bring in the historical context of struggle and the fight for justice, right? So you want to talk about like, not just the civil rights movement, talk about Stonewall, talk about, you know, I don't know, like there's just so many things that you could talk about from the founding of this country all the way through to today. And so I think a lot of kids, when we talk about civics, you know, civics is, again, an act and problem solving, you know, and history is how was it done before? And so allowing students to look at, well, how did somebody do this before when you're reading history, and bringing in many narratives when you're reading that history, right? And then say, now let's apply, like, how do we remix this? And like, how does this apply to today? Like, what's an inequity today that we're all experiencing together, or some people are experiencing? You know, how do we remix what the fight was that stopped so that we can keep the fight going, right? So that's one way as well.
So can I add on? So, because Amber, you just like sparks. So right now I have my kids creating a project that I named Back to the Future. And it actually came about because I gave the students an identity paper to write about a few weeks ago, where they had to compare artists from the 1920s and 2020. But not only did I want them to compare the works, I wanted them to compare why their work was so important. So if we look at the 1920s and the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of the works that was created by African Americans talked about their struggles, right? And even though it sparked this entire movement that was even heard in Europe, they really were trying to tell people America was very divided, right? African Americans were not being treated as equal. And so the kids had to compare that with artists of 2020. So we look at Meek Mill right now, and he's talking about criminal justice. And we look at Jay-Z, who's fighting for the same reason. And we look at a lot of these artists who are now stepping forward. Their music talks about police brutality, talks about injustices, and it's the same as the 1920s. With the Back to the Future project, I have kids now looking at the social, economic, and political impacts that the 1920s had, but now they're back in 2020. So what messages do you have to give to not only the people of 2020, but if you could give Langston Hughes some kind of advice, what advice would you give him? If you could create a museum with 6 artifacts, what would you choose to present? If you could create a movie with actors and actresses from today, but you have to pick an event that happened before, like if you're saying in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed and women were granted the right to vote, but African-American women were stopped at the polls, I need to know that. And so when we talk about cultural relevancy, we also have to discuss what opportunities we're giving kids to make that connection. Because when we think about things that's happening today, and you really study the 1920s, they're the same exact thing, down to the Tulsa riots. It's the same exact thing, right? So we're asking ourselves, what's the next step? Sometimes we got to go backwards and learn about things that happened before and take that advice and then think about what we're going to do today. Oh, I appreciate
Okay, so one last question, then we'll open up for questions from the audience. What are some steps that educators like us and other educators who are not here today can take to infuse just relevancy where it's lacking in the curriculum, and how do we reach all students?
Well, I think one way that we as educators can make sure that relevancy is showing up is sit on curriculum planning committees, sit on textbook selection committees. I, sat on one a couple of years ago here in Texas that selected world geography books, and the one that was selected was one we rejected, and the one that was selected ended up putting slaves as migrant workers. And so, of course, there was a lot of pushback from the educator community. So we've got to be there when the standards are written. We've got to make sure to ensure that our kids are showing up in those textbooks. That's where a lot of the real change can take place, in my view.
I feel like mine is super basic, but like it's humbling yourself to know what you don't know, which all y'all, you know, everyone's here to learn, which that's super dope and appreciated. But like, you know, figuring out like, what don't I know and like, where can I find it, right? Because, you know, your students are depending on you to make sure that you're providing them with a quality experience in the classroom. So, you know, if you don't know something, that is perfectly fine. We have the Library of Congress, we have the National Archives, we have great civic and history and social studies organizations that provide amazing resources for you. Just come get them, I guess.
I think for me, it's meaningful collaboration. And so, you know, anyone could collaborate. Anyone could sit in a room and we could write on chart paper and then we'll forget tomorrow what we wrote because we left it in the same room. When I think of what's our next steps, we have to collaborate with a purpose. And so I'm not saying walk into a room and have 30 questions because it's just not going to happen, right? Come up with one mission and vision and see how many ways we can tackle that. And then you'll be able now to collaborate and say, okay, let's work on these 3 strategies this year. And then when you perfect those 3 strategies, you move on to the next while still bringing those 3 along. And if you didn't perfect it, work on it again instead of just leaving it back. So meaningful collaboration to me is what's going to literally lead us through all of this.
I'm just going to add to that real quick, is because I live in that every day. When I think about team, you know, building these structures where the students are collaborating and not competing with each other about how they're trying to get ahead and what they're trying to do for the next step, where they're pushing and supporting each other. There's a book came out a couple of years ago called The Pact about young men in Newark who basically made a pledge to support each other all the way through education. That should be standard practice, that we're constantly building reinforcement for our students to like say to each other, yeah, I'm going to pick you up when you fall. I see where I'm going to stumble. I hope you pick me up. That kind of work that goes together with what a good educational community is. But it's even deeper than that. And that's like the specialty of why I do the work I do right now, is that I train folks who want to be teacher supervisors. I train folks who want to be principals and superintendents, let alone like department chairs and deans and presidents of universities. Like, you want to be on that track. So it's like the classroom is joyous, but you need to be opening that door for like the next 6 or 12 or 25 people like you who are coming up, so that they're going to get promoted. They're going to get that salary bump. They're going to get the next decision. Like, climb the whole ladder so that you shape not just education in your school, but in that whole city or in your whole state. Like, be real ambitious, because we have very, very few educational leaders that come from these backgrounds. And so come up. Like, you don't have to come to my program. I'll help you find whatever program you want. But like, these options we got to take advantage of.
First of all, I have to apologize. My lights went out. It was storming here in DC, so I'm back. Sorry about all of that. So I would just, and I don't know if anyone has said this already, but just basically going back to knowing your students, learning about them and what their likes and dislikes are. If you learn that and you can connect it with texts that are relevant to them because it connects to their interests, they'll want to read it. They will converse with you about it. And I think doing that, that's going to make it culturally relevant in more ways than one. There are also a few articles that I have noticed that relate to how to be anti-racist in your classroom through Edutopia and Ed Week. And so I think looking at those articles can give you ideas. I can post them on my Twitter account if needed, to help with engaging students and making it culturally relevant for all.
Okay, so let's go ahead and open up to any questions from audience. Thank you for the panelists. This was amazing, and learned so much, and looking forward to continuing this conversation next week. Any questions from the audience?
Hey, this is Emma from iCivics, coming to you from Southeast Georgia. I was really taken, Yuritsa, by your comment about anti-racist curriculum and how for a lot of kids of color. They're like, we know this, you don't need to teach this to us. I think that's a really important point, and it's been lost in all this. So I'm so excited that there's so much attention and enthusiasm around anti-racist education. But I wonder about how we elevate that message about who really needs that education right now. I think a lot of teachers need it, white teachers. I think a lot of white kids need it. But how can the well-meaning liberal white person not create more trauma in the classroom for their students of color who don't need that kind of education right now because they already have it?
I just think it starts with not making an assumption that people don't know. You know, for me, I'm the type of person that when somebody makes an assumption that I don't know something, I shut down. Because in my mind, I'm saying, well, I know this. Like, give me the chance to let you know that I know it, and then you could push me forward based off of what I know first. And so what I would say as educators is, I'm not saying don't use the anti-racist curricula. What I'm saying is be careful with how you introduce it and how you use it. You can't just introduce something with the expectation that people don't know it, you know? And for me, it starts off with, like I said before, knowing your students. If you know your students, then you would know at what point is it that you can introduce certain things, or you may not introduce it. They may be teaching you something, and then from there, you can create a lesson or you can create units that's guided by students. Student voice is important. Allowing students a chance to even speak on their experiences or write journals, then you'll be surprised at some of the things that students know. We can't keep assuming that our kids don't know, because one, that's how our lessons become boring and they're not engaged because we're repeating the same thing over and over. And two, we're not allowing them to explore. That is the purpose of school, to let kids explore, let kids have a mind of their own as opposed to just regurgitating whatever it was that was said in class. And so I think that if we survey our students, even if it's by conversation, even if it's by activity, then we know exactly where to start. We can't just assume that every kid has to read something anti-racist when we don't know what kind of trauma that's going to bring up in classes, especially when some people probably were raised to be racist. And then so that's another part you're gonna have to deal with their parents, and their parents basically pulling them out of your class. So we have to start off at one point, and that point is meeting every kid where they are. And so some of your students may need it. Some other students are probably, they know it already, so you may want to do something totally different with them. And you could probably even use the students who are aware of it with the other students and put them as partners, right? So you just got to create the opportunity by meeting the kids where they are. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience?
How you doing? My name is Gainey from MS 113, math teacher and coach. My question is, what are your recommendations on how to use the information that you all teach as history and social studies educators into interdisciplinary concepts in math and ELA?
So I'll jump in real quick. Statistics is one really amazing place. I manage the Educator Network, and I have a teacher on there. She's a math teacher. So I'll have to go back and ask her where her lessons were on this, but she's using statistics from the National Museum of African American Heritage and Culture, History and Culture, using those statistics to I guess, track the transatlantic slave trade, right? And so the students are getting really deep, important history lessons, right? And then they're also getting some really amazing math lessons in this as well. You know, so I think like statistics is one, like the easiest way to do it, right? Math is a great place where there's overlap. Just gonna throw that out there. Also, environmental studies, right? So, you know, what is the history of, you know, policy as it relates to the environment? Where are the places where, you know, policy has been inequitable? So we study those things, right? And see how that has impacted outcomes in communities of color and low-income communities, and addressing that, right? Pollution and all that. That's a science lesson. That's also history and civics and government.
Yeah, and with that, the SDGs are great frameworks to look at that, whether you're teaching US or world, and frame that out and look at the inequities and where we need to do work. So like looking at our curriculum, but then do some critical looking with the SDGs to further dig deep and have some conversation around that.
And also, for me, and maybe because I love history, I feel like every subject could be mixed in with history, right? So even when we think about early civilizations, Egyptians and Greece, math, science, right? We have to think deep into, I remember when I was in junior high school, I was on a floor that they called Earth Science and Technology. And literally, that's exactly the kind of classes that I took. So I learned about science, I learned about technology, but then if you go on a different floor, it's about the history of dance, and you learn from dances from Alvin Ailey. And so everything that we did within that building, junior high school 113, was tied to some kind of aspect of history. And I feel like when you do that, then a kid who probably hates history because they feel like it's boring, when they go into the history class, they just learned something from math that had to do with history, or on ELA, or on science. And so it allows them to now share with you as a teacher, like, this is what I learned, and how does this connect with your class? I always feel like history could be connected, and for me, it's the easiest, besides ELA, to be connected with every single topic, especially math, especially science. I know at one point, my school, we was going to travel to Ghana, and I know some of the science teachers talked about, the soil there and how different it might be. But also, if we think about some of the first human species, they were found where? In Africa, right? So if we look at how everything ties together, come on, unstoppable history, people.
Anything else from the audience? Thank everybody for the time. As far as there was a question about the iCivics Ed Network, Amber's your lady for that. She's amazing. Like, follow her, mom of all capes, and so is Emma. And it's been such a transformative experience for me to be part of the Ed Network. And I know a lot of the people in the Ed Net are here as well. Just apply, reach out. Amber, when are the dates for the next year?
Yeah, so I'm going to be releasing the application this summer, but you will have through November to fill it out. So just look out for that. We will be promoting it on iCivic social media, but also please email me too. So like if, you're like, oh, wait, what was that opportunity? My email is in the chat, so please just reach out to me. I am so excited to get emails from people. That's all I do all day long.
And make sure to join us next week. We're going to be having a discussion with Tanisha, Liz, and some other people in regards to social studies standards and textbooks, and having more voices and perspectives. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, guys.